Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 199, and we're going to talk about one of the very many ways that a person can be interesting. It was kind of a long day today. Sorry for uploading this late, but I had an opportunity to record an episode with Eric Walwend, his wife, Lila, and one of his sons, Ethan. And it was for the Real Power Family radio show. It's a family that I met at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity conference in DC this year. We talked about a lot of things from my parents, my mom's journey from North Korea to South Korea after the communist takeover of that region, my father coming to America to study, and my untimely termination at my university. Yeah, and we talked about pretty much everything so you could figure out who I am, where I taught, and lots of other things that way, including my name. But I'll leave it for that for the people who are actually interested. But I will formally reveal my own personal identity on this podcast once my arbitration hearing has met and everything is resolved, which uh, ongoing saga. It's been delayed 5 times. So hopefully the next time we'll be able to actually have a hearing. But anyway, towards the end of the interview that I had today, we talked about generalizations. That is, we talked about race theory, and I offered up my definition of race, that they're generalizations based on a single identifiable characteristic, but also mentioned that they're basically stereotypes. And so people, when they hear their stereotype and recognize that they themselves fit into a certain stereotype, they will either live up to or live down to those stereotypes. Or, perhaps they will try to do everything to violate that stereotype. Now, the thing that we have to keep in mind is for a time, stereotyping was considered a very bad thing, perhaps racist in the negative sense. But really, what we have to realize is really what we have to remember is that stereotypes is just the starting point of getting to know someone, right? So you look at a person, there's a generalization there, and then you start to learn details about that person. Does this person confirm or affirm, the expected traits that this stereotype tells me I should expect, or does this person surprise me? For most people who only see the one racialization and say there's nothing beyond it, there's nothing to learn, I'm just going to simply treat this person in a certain way, then potentially, not always, but potentially, there may be problems. Now, understanding that there are stereotypes and that which is just simply the starting point for us to get to know someone, it makes us realize the dangers of conformity. Now, conformity or homogeneity, where there is no difference from one person to another, is situationally that is sometimes desired, right? So in the military, on a team, you want there to be a lot of homogeneity. You don't want individuality, especially in something like the military. So you want everyone functioning together as a team, unified in purpose, uh, you know, purpose and method, right? You don't want a cowboy, say, for example, someone a maverick, who's going to basically break the rules and do things on their own, which are unexpected and could potentially interfere with the proper functioning of everybody else. Now, that is the situation where homogeneity or conformity is desired. But on an everyday basis, we're actually seeking interesting. That is, we're looking for the different, the unusual, the special. And that generally is what entertains us, right? You don't go to see mediocre people boxing each other or fighting each other, right? Although I have to admit, sometimes when you see a viral video, maybe that's what is kind of interesting, especially if they're trying to pass themselves off as being an expert, maybe. But generally, when we want to be entertained, we look for something that is different, something that is unusual, something beyond the expected, like a sort of wait till the end type thing. So the outcome or the conclusion will be something that we don't expect. And so this violation of expectation, which I discussed in the context of humor, uh, sometimes the violation of our expectation can be funny in that humorous sense, but it's always interesting, right? So only sometimes it'll be kind of funny, sometimes it'll be shocking, but it's always interesting. Now, it also is not a guarantee that something is positive, right? It can be a negative thing, like being a serial killer, for example, that not productive, not positive, not desirable in any way, but it's different, right? So I shared a bunch of examples already, but maybe one that I didn't share before was the fact that when I was younger, 50 years ago, it was kind of unusual to see an Asian with no accent, right? So the accent that I had, uh, like if I talked on the phone, no one would guess that I was Asian. And I remember ordering pizza sometimes and showing up to pick it up. And people were kind of surprised because I would just leave my name. I wouldn't leave my last name, obviously, but I would leave my English name. And when I show up to pick up the food, you can see the surprise on that person's face because I talked to them on the phone and they never would have guessed that I was Asian. Then I had right, so it makes it a little bit interesting. Like, oh, hey, I never would have thought that you were Asian. I had that Georgian student, a student from Georgia, who was blonde and blue eyed and self identified as an Asian. Kind of surprising, interesting. Why do you think that? It's a start of a conversation where you realize this person is an individual. It goes beyond the stereotype. One example that I raised even in the podcast episode was Myron Rolle, who was an NFL football player for a number of years, and he retired after, I guess, 4 or 5 years to become a neurosurgeon. And then there's another example, John Urschel, who stopped playing in the NFL. He was like a lineman, so one of the big dudes, and he stopped, retired from the NFL to pursue a PhD in math. And so this difference, this violation of the stereotypical image of a type of person, a racialization, makes that person really interesting, fascinating. In fact, this is why so many of the so-called woke are boring, right? Because there's never any deviation from the script. I don't know how they can stand each other. It's just so boring, right? But I think if they are amongst themselves and they're united in whatever woke cause that they are, that they showed up for, that if they do actually have a conversation, they start sharing stories to show how different they are, even in the smallest kind of way. Otherwise, how do you live being so boring, right? So, in other words, the activism itself can only, the excitement of participating in that single-minded, very simplistic activism, the excitement can only last so long. And for the vast majority, they get over it. It becomes boring. So, having a conversation with someone who is deep into some kind of narrow-minded cause, they can't have a conversation beyond the script. So if you give them a response, give them a reply, say something which is unexpected, the normal reaction is they try to get you back on track with the script because they don't know how to talk about anything else. They don't know how to argue or have a discussion about something else, right? Everything that they know that they're going to spew out is following a script. That's why they can say it so fast. That's why they can try to overwhelm you with a barrage of sort of extremely subjective, narrowly subjective information, right? Because how are you going to respond at all if they ask you 30 minutes of questions, right? So where do you even begin? A lot of the participants of these kinds of activism, this kind of activism, they have to be kind of mindless, right? Maybe to the point where a lot of them get jaded, disillusioned, or even wake up, right? Now, agreement on a principle like freedom, which is the message that was advocated at a conference like the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which is where I met the Walwyn family. There, people plug into the idea. And when you meet the people that are there, they're from all over the country, all over the world, from diverse backgrounds, different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, but they all are down with freedom, right? And this is where you can express and, share your thoughts and opinions without, you know, sort of being canceled, but rather people being interested in what you bring to the table. This is where differences becomes opportunity for sharing, differences of ideas, experiences, the stories. This is the is the setting for there to be exchange without any fear of people calling the police because you're there. Um, and this kind of conference shows how the one size fits all style of government and particularly of legislation just does not work. It fails because it doesn't take into account the natural diversity that is there in society. So, legislation which targets a stereotype, a racialization, a category, a generalization, implicates and catches a lot of other people which people generally did not imagine could possibly exist. I talked about the Flexner Report once, the Flexner Report of 1910, and it was basically a report about the state of hospitals and medical schools in the country. And so, through the Flexner Report, a standard was imposed on what would make something a legitimate hospital or legitimate medical school. And so Congress said, oh, okay, that's great. So let's pass these standards. And it was celebrated. But among the hospitals and med schools that were closed were the 10 medical schools which accepted Black students, right? And so who were fixated on quality and safety did not think about, you know, minority students who were rejected at schools which had a lot of money, and so therefore would be trained at these schools which did not have all the bells and whistles of other medical schools, but they were shut down simply because they didn't have enough beakers or they didn't have enough, tools or equipment like all of these other very wealthy medical schools. And so it's a failure to imagine, the kind of person who would go to a medical school like that. War is another example where a racialization or a generalization or a stereotype results in implicating lots of people that most normal people would not, cheer as a victory of that war. So, for example, the Gulf War, Madeleine Albright, because she was the first female Secretary of State, I guess, she was receiving a Freedom Medal. And she gave an interview prior to receiving it. And one of the questions was, hey, so in the Gulf War, 1 million people were killed, 500,000 of them were children. Was it worth it? And to which she said, sure, yeah, it was worth it. Now, the average American, if you're saying, hey, do this Gulf War, but it will mean 500,000 dead kids, children, babies, how gung ho are you about it? A lot of people, not all, but some people would say, whoa, I didn't think of it. I thought we were just killing Iraqis, evil Iraqis. No, yeah, sure, you'll get a lot of them as well, but you're also going to kill a lot of children. Maybe it would cause people to hesitate a little bit, right? But that's the sort of danger of legislation or government activity based on a stereotype or a generalization. So we have to remember that each of us have an infinite number of racializations. That's part of what our identity is, that we have so many different traits, so many characteristics, so many characteristics, which means that we belong to an infinite number of racial groups. And it's the worst thing to do for any of us to do is to deny our inherent diversity and trade it for propaganda or trendy scholarship or worse, woke ideas, right? Cultural capital or our personal value, those traits that we have should be cultivated rather than sacrificed to signal some sort of virtue or to succeed in a narrow minded world, right? The sense of belonging should not require us to sacrifice our individuality. So, what was really awesome about attending the Ron Paul conference is that the individuality is celebrated while sharing the sense of belonging to the idea of freedom, a community that prioritizes freedom. I guess it's easy for me, in spite of being Korean and Korean society, at least 30, 50 years ago, was all about conformity, homogeneity. It came up in class today. We were talking about left-handed people. And, I mentioned that in Korean society back in the day, if you attend school and you start to try to write left-handed, you get a little knock on the wrist or your knuckles from the teacher to put that pen or pencil in your right hand. Even when I had kids, of course, I don't remember my parents doing that to me, but my mom told me that I always tried to write with my left hand and I would always get a little, scolding and write with my right. But then one of my kids, no matter what we did, he just would not write with his right hand. In fact, he couldn't even open his right hand until he was like 2 years old. And so everything he did was with his left hand. And so he was like, it was almost like, hey, man, I don't care what you do. I am going to be left handed for the rest of my life. So that was kind of interesting. So that's Korean society, very, very into homogeneity. But my father, he always marched to his own beat, even to the point where if you write, up until I think graduation of high school, pretty much everyone writes exactly the same way. But if you look at my father's handwriting, extremely, extremely nonconformist. So, on the one hand, he strictly adhered to certain cultural norms, behavior standards, but he always practiced a large amount of individuality. And that's what he passed on to us. So, in spite of the fact that we recognize that when someone looks at us, they're going to have certain stereotypes come to mind, which is perfectly fine. But at the same time, what we do is we try to violate all of those stereotypes, all of those expectations in the most positive way possible. So true diversity on the individual level makes us and our society better, right? It's through this exercise of diversity that we weed out destructive traits like serial killing and foster productive ones, right? Like inventing or innovating new equipment, ideas, new theories. So, particularly in a world and time where nurturing unproductive and destructive traits like war, violence, in this kind of world, let's remember the benefits of freedom with responsibility. That's it for today. I will talk to you again next time.